The epic definitive story of Sylvanas Windrunner, one of World of Warcraft's most enduring and iconic characters, as chronicled by best-selling author Christie. Ranger General, Banshee Queen, War Chief, Sylvanas Windrunner has borne many titles. To some she is a hero, to others a villain. But whether in pursuit of justice, vengeance, or something more, Sylvanas has always sought to control her own destiny. The power to achieve her goals has never been closer, as Sylvanas works alongside the jailer to liberate all Azeroth from the prison of fate. Her final task? Secure the fealty of their prisoner, King Anduin Rin. To succeed, Sylvanas will be forced to reflect on the harrowing path that brought her to the jailer's side, and to reveal her truest self to her greatest rival. Here, Sylvanas' complete story is laid bare. The breaking of the Windrunner family and her rise to Ranger General, her own death at the hands of Arthas and her renewed purpose in founding the Forsaken, the moment she first beheld the Maw and understood the true consequences of what lay beyond the veil of death. But as her moment of victory draws near, Sylvanas Windrunner will make a choice that may ultimately come to define her, a choice that's hers to make. So reads the blurb of Sylvanas by Christie, and this is an episode of Blurbal Reasoning where I talk about that book, because I just done read it, didn't I? Now, for those of you who may not know, I am a long-time fan of World of Warcraft, so I'm well acquainted with the lore and the characters and the history, quite well acquainted. In fact, it's actually like the world I'm potentially most invested in out of all of fiction, for better or for worse. And so the first thing I'm going to say about this book is that if you are not like me and you are not well acquainted with the lore and the history of World of Warcraft, this book is not for you. There have been World of Warcraft books in the past where I've been like, this could potentially stand on its own as a standalone book. This is not one of those books. In fact, I would argue that as much praise as I'm about to throw at this book, spoilers, one of my gripes is that the pacing kind of suffers for the fact that whenever Christie approaches something that's already been tackled in a short story by someone else or as part of a book that she's already written somewhere else down the line, she skips over it, obviously, because otherwise you're telling the same story twice. But the problem with that is that we have like some very in-depth stuff regarding Sylvanas and her life for a few years, and then we just kind of like jump over to the next thing, and sometimes over fairly major things too. But before I get too far along in a gripe, this is actually a really fucking good book. I absolutely adored it from beginning to end. I think the first half was maybe slightly stronger than the second half for reasons I'll get into later, but overall just this book has been really, really fun to read and has changed my opinion on Sylvanas a little bit, which is probably what Christie set out to do. I read it via Audible, so I was listening to Patty Mattson, the voice actress of Sylvanas herself, tell the story, and that was a delight in itself, by the way. I highly recommend the audio version if you get the chance. I believe, as I'm recording this, because there's always some weird arbitrary delay with the UK version of the book, even though it's the same language, it's not actually available in ebook or physical book format yet in the UK. It's only available in audiobook format, which is super dumb. And I'm not going to rant about that because it's beyond anyone's control except the publishers. I mean, at least I speak English, right? There's probably bigger delays for non-English speaking languages. So to begin with, as I already kind of have actually begun, I will be talking about the book in fairly broad terms, but then I'm going to go into specifics because I took notes. It's something new I'm trying. We'll see how it affects the length of the video. In a broad sense, I would say this book was a triumph, especially the first half, as I've already alluded to. The first half deals with a living Sylvanas, her youth as a high elf among the Windrunner family, and her relationship with her sisters, and her relationship with her family in general, and all that good stuff. And it was just, every single moment of it was delightful, especially because you are reading it through the lens of someone who knows what Sylvanas becomes, and how this is a character which very much is not that later character, and you're wondering just how that changes, when it changes, why it changes, how this can possibly be the same person. And one of the things that's most interesting about this novel is watching her change slowly over time. There's definitely moments when the change is more abrupt, but for instance there are moments like, and I am going to start spoiling the book here, there are moments like after Lirith dies, you start to hear Sylvanas, like a more recognizable Sylvanas than you would expect pre-murder. You know what I mean? Like, before she becomes a banshee, she becomes hard. My apologies, I have a bit of a cold right now, so I probably sound very stuffy. I think I wrote in my notes the chapter where she decides to go and investigate the deaths of her parents is the first time where she sounds recognisable, and I don't just mean in terms of like Patty Matson, the way she acts her, although that probably contributes substantially to this perception I have, but just how she's being like hardcore pragmatic and telling people that like, no, this needs to be done, and like she's giving orders, and it's the first real glimpse we get of Sylvanas as we know her, although she's, still got a beating heart at this moment in the story. I was surprised at just... I shouldn't have been surprised, I just didn't give this book that much forethought before I delved into it, but I was surprised at how much high elf lore we obviously got in the first half of the book, and it actually made me want to go play a blood elf. I've never really stuck with a blood elf character. My demon hunter is a blood elf, but kind of just by circumstance, so I actually went and made a blood elf in the middle of reading this book. Out of all the races in WoW, I do tend to gravitate towards the elves, but never the blood elves or the high elves. They've never interested me as much as like the night elves, for instance, and like this book I think has changed that for good. I'm now super interested in blood elves and their whole tragic past. The biggest kind of part of the story which I wasn't too fussed with, strangely, was the part after Arthas killed her and raised her as a banshee, so the stuff that would have been in Warcraft 3. And it might just be because I've never played Warcraft 3, and as I've previously mentioned, this isn't really a book for people who aren't familiar with the source material, so I'm less familiar with the source material for this part of the book, right? So maybe that's why I felt a little bit more detached from it. But again, because these events were depicted in Warcraft 3, they were kind of, I don't want to say skipped over, like there were definitely scenes with dialogue and like stuff like that, but a lot of the time I was just thinking like, wait, when would this have been happening? Okay, and then this was before this happened, and it kind of took me out of it a little bit, but maybe that's a me problem. But when Sylvanas did find her body and start leading the Forsaken, and then it kind of transitioned into the events of World of Warcraft, I did kind of become a little bit more invested in the story again, and it was interesting to hear how she began to change in Undeath, how for instance, the first thing I noted was how she was literally torturing a woodland creature to try and figure out how to make this blight that she would be using to torture Arthas as he died, which is very, it's a far cry from the woodlands loving elf we knew in the first half of the story. And it's interesting as well to note that in previous kind of iterations of Warcraft lore, it's kind of, I can't remember off the top of my head, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of been mentioned that when you're raised into Undeath, you like lose like some of your emotions, some of your memories, some of what makes you who you are fundamentally, and it kind of felt like they were moving away from that in more recent lore, but it seems like that's still apparent here. It just doesn't excuse what she does as much, so it's less Sylvanas in Banshee mode evil lol, and it's more like she's different and she's got different motivations, and that informs the choices that she makes, no matter how bad those choices may be. We of course now know that her soul was shorn in two when she got killed by Arthas, and she only gets that second part of her soul back later on, but it's not necessarily the fact that the part of her soul she lost was like kindness and love, and it's a little bit of that, but not entirely. It was kind of fascinating to read the events of World of Warcraft from her perspective, especially obviously post Wrath of the Lich King, when she dies on a Saronite and she meets the jailer and she's being taken on a tour of all the afterlives, and seeing how unfair all of it is, how they're not reunited with their loved ones. I think the biggest saving grace of this book is it succeeds in making part of us agree with the jailer, or at least, the version of the jailer that he's showing himself to Sylvanas. Like, yeah, if you died and then you weren't reunited with your loved ones, it would be kind of a shitty afterlife, wouldn't it? For the first time in this book, the jailer's cause seems like something that you can see someone agreeing to, although I don't think I personally would have the stomach to. As the jailer puts it, you'll probably have to do some atrocities, but that's okay. It's all for the greater good, right? And while I am 10,000% sure this lore with the jailer was not written at the time that Edge of Night was originally written, where Sylvanas kills herself and comes back and gets all the ability to raise the dead through the Valkyrie and stuff, I do like the rewritten version of the lore where she's like looking at these events, and for the most part it aligns with her actions as written in like Cataclysm and Miss of Pandaria and stuff like that, where she's seeing how unfair all of it is. That being said, it's not 100% convincing in all of the time. There are some moments. I will be going into them in more detail in my notes section of the video, but I think Christie Golden did as brilliant of a job as she possibly could have with it. But I'm sorry, Blizzard, you're not convincing me. This is not the original lore that was written for Sylvanas way back in Warcraft 3. And the problem with that is a lot of the second half of this book becomes Sylvanas will say a line of dialogue sandwiched between like multiple paragraphs of her point of view talking about why she feels that way, because it's Christie Golden telling the audience why within this new canon she's reacting the way she did like 7 years ago, with this new perspective of, oh, it's because I'm doing the jailer's bidding and life is unfair and all of this, you know? It feels like a lot of explaining and not as much storytelling as it was in the first half. And it's explaining that needed to be done. It's just, you know, for the sake of this book, on its own merits, it is a criticism I have. It's not, you know, it's not perfect, but it's still good. One thing I haven't mentioned so far is the interludes, which I think were fantastically done. Every, I would say, fifth or so of the book, we take a break and we hear how Anduin is receiving this story in his cell in Torghast during 9.1. And Anduin absolutely takes up the mantle of the player's reaction here, of how we've been reacting to everything she's been doing and how we would react to her telling us these things and being like, so you think that, you know, you had a tragic life, but you think that makes it okay to fucking murder an entire civilization full of innocent people? And he's really angry at her and stuff like this. He absolutely represents the player here, and I think it's really well done, and really important that he's there to do that, by the way. It's like Christie Golden's reminding us every fifth of a book, by the way, this isn't me justifying her actions, this is Sylvanas justifying her actions, and obviously you won't be having any of it. I haven't looked at the reception to this book among the player base so far. I'm wondering how effective that actually was. It looks like this book's been receiving good ratings on Amazon, so hopefully, I don't know, this player base, man, ooh, I don't go to that subreddit these days because, oh boy. So yeah, that's going to kind of wrap up how I feel about this book in a broad sense. I'm going to talk about my notes now. I'll try to make it not sound too stilted. I'll try and talk about it quite naturally, but we're going to rewind the tape, we're going to go back to the start of a book, and we're going to talk about things that stood out to me throughout the chapters. Oh yeah, so right from the beginning in the prologue, I did like how Christie Golden emphasised the fact that Anduin had been tortured, because from where we are in the game right now, we're just dealing with his trauma of being dominated and doing all of these horrible things that he didn't want to do. It's good that we got this reminder that, hey, by the way, he was tortured pretty badly too. Like, you know? I'm really interested to see how this informs Anduin's character moving forward. I thought it was interesting to note that we were starting the book with a young Sylvanas, because this book is all about her relationship with life and death and why she wants to change it. The first chapter feels very ominous in that light. Like, we see how much she loves people, like her father, and how different her life was when she had her family compared to, you know, how she is now. I've already kind of touched on that. At this point, I thought we'd never heard of Lirith, but when I went back to read the Three Sisters comic, where the Windrunner sisters met up after the events of Legion, he was actually there in the in their memories, and I looked him up on the wiki, and it seems like he was in Illyria's kind of flashbacks in Beyond the Dark Portal as well in that novel, which I need to go and read. I haven't read that one, and now I really want to. I immediately picked up on the fact that she called him Little Lord Sun, the way she calls Anduin Little Lion, and that's obviously something Anduin points out to us at the end of a book, but, you know, it was fairly obvious from the very start. And it was also super interesting to me, who never knew about Lirith before, or who forgot about him, I guess, to be like, oh, this is why she's weirdly endearing towards Anduin. That makes a lot of sense. Straight off the bat, I'm learning things about Sylvanas. I really enjoyed the fact that Lirith sings Lament of the Highborn as well, again, from a future perspective. Looking back, I immediately understood why that song meant as much as it did to Sylvanas in her famous quest where you give her the pendant. It's what this book does so well. It kind of retroactively adds new context to her character. In chapter 3, when she's telling Lirith that there's more than one way to save people, that's a direct quote, because he's down on himself about the fact that while all of his sisters are doing cool things like being Ranger General and stuff like that, or training to be Ranger General, he's just there you know, in his own quotes, he's just there singing songs and, you know, just being there for entertainment. And Sylvanas is like, no, like, this is so much more. This is important. Like, I am fighting for the ability for people like you to enrich people's lives. And it was just such a beautiful study in, like, the importance of, you know, music and writing and stuff like that. And, you know, I don't think this was anything weird, like Christie Golden patting herself on the back for being a writer. Like, I know someone's going to have that cynical take. I think it was more Christie Golden telling other prospective writers that what they do is worthwhile, and it actually, I found it really touching as a prospective writer. Thanks, Christie. The fake out with Lirith's death in chapter 4 was really weird, because obviously we are all expecting Lirith to die, but he after Sylvanas, and this is a little thing I picked up on which isn't explicitly told to us. Sylvanas goes to this party where she's not meant to go to try and make Lirith feel like there's someone there supporting him, right? And in doing so, she comes across a bunch of bullies who are being really mean to him. So she spikes their drink with I forget what it's called, woundwood or something, to make their mouths, like, they can't control what they're saying, and like their mouths go slack and all that. And she thinks it's a really great prank, and obviously it backfires. But Lirith later points out to her that they thought they were being poisoned, and this would have been absolutely terrifying for them. So Lirith's prank, where he decides to float face down in the water and look like he's dead, is more than foreshadowing to us. It's him subtly getting back at Sylvanas, like, yeah, what you just felt is what they were feeling, and it wasn't actually very nice, and maybe you shouldn't be like that. And props to him, I guess. Sylvanas does say, like, oh, I guess it's time to stop playing pranks, huh? Like, that was mean of me. So she learns a lesson. It wasn't, like, explicitly stated that it was a lesson he was teaching her, but I mean, at the same time, it kind of was. And you can make a further argument here that Lirith represents her her sense of morality, and when he dies later on, that's, you know, not there as much. Sylvanas seems to think that he was there for her in spirit, even as she became a Banshee Queen and did a whole bunch of horrible stuff, but I'm not quite as convinced. You still burnt that tree, didn't you? Although she would argue that she had good reason, we'll get to that later on. I wasn't entirely ready for Sylvanas to be a socially awkward prankster in her youth, but I'm here for it. So one little subtlety I picked up on, which could just be me, it could just be me interpreting this weirdly, but in chapter 6, Illyria makes a decision to, you know, leave the Fast Riders and go travelling the world and everything, and her mother disagrees vehemently, but Valera, when it is all said and done, tells the Fast Riders that it was her mother's plan all along, kind of like, oh, it's been decided, Larissa's decided that Illyria will travel far and wide and gain new allies for the High Elves, while Sylvanas will stay on as your Ranger General. And that feels familiar. It feels a little bit like how Blizzard sometimes announce plans as if they were always meant to be that way regarding the game, when the rest of us kind of always knew that it wasn't meant to be that way. But that might just be me reading into things that aren't there. But that is how that felt to me. Of course, this kind of marks the end of an era in Sylvanas' life where her family are going to start splitting up and going off and doing their own things. And when she is told that nothing lasts forever, she says, I suppose, with an exaggerated sigh. And I just wanted to point that out because that's, you know, that's something that she is directly opposed to throughout the rest of her life, the idea that nothing lasts forever. Around this point we get the first interlude, and Anduin is so angry at her. He's like, yeah, okay, you think this justifies you murdering the Night Elves? And Sylvanas is like, I fucking knew he'd throw this at me. Fucking asshole. And as I've said before, obviously, Anduin mimics the players here, including me, obviously. I would also react like he did in this situation. I found it interesting that the first time Sylvanas met Nephanos was around the first time she had killed someone, like a troll, and, you know, it'd been mentioned that this was her second taste of combat, but I assume they mean that her first taste of combat was in the trial, in frickin' what's her name's trial, Illyria's trial, and she killed the Springpaw Lynx. So this would be her first real kill, right? And it's her first time meeting Nephanos, and I just thought that was interesting, considering obviously her and Nephanos are together in Death, and they plot lots of Death, and Death's... Would you be surprised to hear that Death is a major theme in this book? but it's also a major theme between the two of them. It's not really something that was present in the writing, but I mean, just by happenstance it was there, so I thought I'd point it out. When Sylvanas forgets Lirith's birthday and she goes to see him and he's really upset by her, instead of telling him that she loves him, she just runs away because she's worried about him rejecting her, which is like, I mean, damn, seek therapy, but also it's the first sign of her really like not being able to deal well with pain and avoiding it, and literally running from it. I think it's also a very good example of how her life was touched by pain before she ever experienced the death of a loved one. Speaking of the death of a loved one, however, her parents have just got bipped. Sylvanas kind of adopts pragmatism in this chapter, and it never really leaves. She knows that if she doesn't go and examine the murder of her parents herself, people will think she's soft and they won't accept her as Ranger General, so she puts her feelings to one side, as she all too often does, and she goes and looks upon the corpses of her parents. I loved the overt symbolism of Sylvanas taking the mothers from her arrow's quiver and putting them in her own. I thought it was interesting that the news of her parents' death left a gaping feeling in her chest, which is reminiscent of her own future killing wound. I also found it interesting that Sylvanas is very driven by justice from the outset. She's not really a character you would consider to be driven by justice in the traditional sense that we've seen her up until this point, but this book really makes a case for it. But it was interesting to see her butting heads with King Anasterion, who's like, no, we can't start a war with the Horde, I'm sorry, like, it's going to result in so much unnecessary death. And I frankly would have been interested to see a version of this universe which was like the Ranger General Sylvanas versus the King Asterion politics-wise, if nothing wrong had happened regarding, like, obviously the events of Warcraft 2 and 3 and World of Warcraft and everything in between. There was an interesting relationship there, but obviously I guess it didn't last long. I find it notable that the chapter ends with it being mentioned that Sylvanas would do anything to stop another day without her parents in it dawning, which, you know, is kind of her actual objective later on in the storyline. Not exactly, but, you know, she can't stand being apart from her family, and she would do anything to change that, and that's the first glimpse we really get of what Sylvanas turns into, and obviously it begins with death. At this point in the story, we really can't imagine Sylvanas leading the Orcs in any capacity later down the line, and that's only going to get worse. So again, it's very interesting reading this from a future perspective. Orcs murder her parents, and as we're about to see in a minute, her brother, whom she loves very dearly, and instead of growing to hate them as Illyria does and make it her mission to exterminate them and all of this, I mean, you know, she does to start with, but as we know, she ends up leading them, and it's just like, damn, you come a long way, huh? It's one of the aspects of her character that I can never quite get my head around, and is that this book really helps to kind of make me understand. I think before she even finds Lirith's body on the battlefield, the fact that it was her home village that got culled as she's walking through it and recognising dead people in the streets, I think before she ever found Lirith, that had a profound effect on her in terms of life and death and viewing it all as unfair and being traumatised by it. The double fake out with Lirith was extremely rude. I've written here in capital letters, Christie Golden, how dare you, that was really rude, I don't like it. He was a precious boy, let him live. For those of you who don't remember or for some reason don't care about spoilers, what I'm referring to here is she sees him and she's like, Lirith! And then, like, you're like, oh god, Lirith's dead. And then she's like, oh wait, no. Oh, it's not him. He wouldn't be wearing that. Obviously. He wouldn't be wearing ranger clothes. He's not a ranger. He'd be wearing court bard clothes or whatever he was. And then, like, it slowly dawns on her again. Oh no, it's him. And it's so sad. I also couldn't help but note here that Sylvanas' objective with Anduin is the exact opposite of her objective with Lirith. With Lirith, she wants to keep him away from her world and protect him as much as possible, whereas with Anduin, she seeks to bring him in to make him understand. It's a very cool inversion of, you know, past her versus present her. Also notable that as wrenching of a loss as Lirith is, Sylvanas doesn't rush to tell Varisa. She gets on with her duties first, which really, again, drives home how hardcore pragmatic she is. Varisa learning about his death also was as cruel as possible. A real she's right behind me, isn't she moment. It's just Christie Gordon, who hurt you? Sylvanas herself reasons that there was no reason to gentle the blow. I also like the line, how was it her heart could break so many times, keep beating, keeping her here for the torment of so much loss. She's a real Evanescence girl, this Sylvanas. Another thing I haven't mentioned so far, by the way, that this book does really well is selling us on the love between Sylvanas and Nathanos, which has really never been represented that well before. I think it's built up so prominently here because it really is her saving grace in her undeath. In this interlude, Anduin calls Sylvanas out on her extreme hypocrisy, which I really enjoyed. He's like, oh, so you really hated losing the ones you loved? Yeah, I bet the people in Teldrassil really hated losing the ones they loved as well. I love him, he's so good. Oh, the people you loved were killed by an invading force? I wonder who led an invading force recently. Come on, we've all been thinking it. Oh, I love that part 3 is called, What are we if not slaves to this torment? I don't know why I gave her a Cockney accent there, but you know. There you go. Okay, so this is where some of my criticisms come in. I wasn't a huge fan of the fact that some years of important developments got skipped over from the end of the Second War to Arthas killing her, basically. Up until this point, every part of Sylvanas' life had been relayed to us in really high detail, but at this point it's just like, yeah, then some years passed, you already know about the whole Third War thing, you know, and then Arthas kills her, you get it, let's move on. I'm like, no, I want to see everything from her point of view. Like, I guess, you know, you can't make the book 1,000 pages long, but Robert Jordan did it. Fuck it, make the book 1,000 pages long. As much as I was partially checked out of a book for this duration of it, it was harrowing when, you know, she was forced to kill the children first as she was desperately trying to hold on to her identity. Again, though, it feels like we're kind of viewing it from this... I don't know if this was done on purpose, because she's not all there. She's like a banshee. She's like half of herself. But it feels like we're viewing it from afar, if you know what I mean, because she's trying to distance herself from it as well. These characters that we've been close up with, down on the ground with, who we know intimately, they die from like up above when we're not looking at them, when we're not paying attention to their features. Obviously it's because we're Sylvanas and we're not down on the ground with them at this moment, but I don't know, it's just kind of a shame. This is where that scene happens where she mixes woundwood into a poison and tests it on forest animals, and she's watching the bear, you know, suffer, and she's like, it's a shame I'm making it suffer, but it's for a greater good. And then she literally says the quote, I do need it to suffer. I loved the scene where Sylvanas was sat in the trees listening to was it Haldoran and Lorthamar talk about her, and it really informs her character moving forwards, because she thinks she can drop down and be like, hey, it's me, I'm good again, let's be friends, but they're like, you know, she appears in my nightmares, she's such a monster. And it was a very Frankenstein moment. I enjoyed it a lot. I loved that for more than just one reason, though. I loved how it really cemented the horror of what happened to the Blood Elves, I guess, at this point. How 80% of them had died, how Lorthamar and Haldoran, who had been so bright and chipper before, were just so like morose and like, you know, kind of, it felt like they were talking through the broken pieces of their lives. I tweeted at Christie Golden asking her to do like a biography of all my favourite characters. I have been thinking about which ones I would actually like her to do. I think I'd like to see a Lorthamar biography, to be honest. It would be fascinating. I love that we get a flashback to Sylvanas remembering Lirith's rant about how after their parents had died, the world that he knew was gone forever. And I remember at the time that being like foreshadowing, but it's nice that it got paid off here, because now she's like, now the world that he knew literally is gone forever. I think it's also interesting to hear how Nathanos was the reason that she decided to go and find and free the undead. She was thinking of him when she thought of Lordaeron and everything. Obviously another reason would be that she failed to assassinate Arthas. I think I skipped over that bit in my notes, but she failed to assassinate Arthas because a child of Lordaeron you know, stopped her from killing him just long enough, and he seemed so proud to serve his king, and she thought they shouldn't be Scourge. And as she thought that, she pictured Nathanos and was like, her love for him kind of became her love for the people of Lordaeron. We jump ahead again to a point when Sylvanas has successfully taken Lordaeron. I'm just guessing here because I've never played it, but I'm thinking that might be a Warcraft 3 mission, so it's probably already documented somewhere. And yeah, this chapter chapter 15, does a really good job of cementing Sylvanas' hatred of the living. Like, as she takes her place as the ruler of the undead, she's like, the fucking living despise us. We don't need them. I also noted that Nathanos has never been this interesting before. When he comes back in chapter 16, when she finds him as a shambling undead, and she has to kind of nurse him back to sanity, and she needs him there to kind of not be her rock, but to kind of be someone she can confide in. You know, it's like Nathanos has only ever been like her lapdog, like her toy boy, for want of a better term, up until this point. I prefer this version of Nathanos greatly. Note: Interlude. Anduin continues to react as the reader would. I did find it kind of sad that after just one failed attempt at, you know, trying to get the Alliance on her side, she immediately abandons them and starts considering the Horde. And while the rest of the chapter does kind of expand upon this and make it more rational, to begin with, I was like, alright, like, maybe send another person, maybe send a letter. After Arthas and the Scourge, you could make a point for the Alliance being so anti-undead that they were horrified. They sent a letter back being horrified, or, you know, more than just they killed the missives before they could get there and say anything. You could have it be more of like a, they actively said, no, you should probably just end your lives and not be the shades of the people we once knew. I think that would be more effective and more believable. Like, that doesn't have to be how they react today, obviously, because we live in a different Azeroth. We live in more enlightened times. We've got Twitter. But back then it would have made a lot of sense. Anyway, Ken's a fucking baller. We love Ken. He's so like, oh, I'm sorry to hear this happened to you. Come over here to Kalimdor. We'll talk about this. Yeah, you guys seem alright. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we feel like you guys actually, like, you know, we're all about life and rejuvenation and regeneration, and you guys, you're like an argument for rebirth. And while Sylvanas fucking hates that, I'm like, wow, Ken is really kind. I like him a lot. Shame about what happened to him. It's also made very obvious when she talks to Thrall that this is not the same kind of orc that murdered her family, and I guess that's how she kind of makes that okay in her mind, as well as the promise to herself that she's not really part of a horde, she's just using them. I also found it weird, this is one aspect of Sylvanas' character that I've never really come to terms with, and this book doesn't really fix. She mentions that she only loves the Forsaken as far as she can use them. But it's still mentioned earlier in this very book, and later in this book, how much she does love her people. But she also only uses them as a tool. It doesn't really gel. So the only thing I've written down for chapter 18 is that I'm confused as to why Haldoran became the Ranger General and not Varisa, but I guess that's just a gap in the lore that I don't know about. Maybe Varisa decided not to stay in Silvermoon after everything. The first time, or I guess maybe one of the only times we hear Sylvanas sounding like her old self, her old living self with kindness and all that, is when she's sat at Lirith's grave and talking to him. And that kind of happens again later in the book as well, and it's the same case there. And there's an argument to be made that, again, while Sylvanas has lost half of her soul, it isn't necessarily the half with all of the kindness in it, if you know what I mean. It's not as simple as dead Sylvanas bad, living Sylvanas good, and this book takes great pains to make that obvious, and I like it a lot. Sylvanas does have her I can't believe I'm allied with orcs moment at his grave as well, which I'm glad that was put in there, because otherwise I would have had slight issues. Now, this part of the book covers all the way up to Wrath of the Lich King, and it's still left kind of vague as to why she wasn't at Icecrown Citadel when we're taking him on. And, you know, this is something I was looking forward to reading. I was like, okay, why wasn't she there? Because at first she's like, oh, I'll stay here until they breach Icecrown Citadel, and then I'll join them and be part of a kill. But then she just kind of doesn't. It's just mentioned that she misses out, and then, you know, the story continues from there, and it's just like... It kind of feels like the writers of Wrath of the Lich King back in the day forgot about her, forgot that she was important for that part of the story, and to the Lich King and all that. Maybe I'm being too mean. Maybe this was the whole point. Maybe they were meant to make Sylvanas feel like she'd missed out. Maybe, you know, it wasn't too long after this that they wrote Edge of Night, right? Maybe this was part of them setting up a new character arc for Sylvanas where she felt lost and didn't know what to do with her life now. But it really did just feel like the writers forgot about her, and there was no reason for her not to be there. And even Christie Golden was like, she just wasn't there. She just kind of missed out. It's less than ideal. So obviously then Edge of Night happens, she throws herself off, meets the jailer, which wasn't in Edge of Night because, cough cough, the jailer didn't exist until a couple of years ago in the minds of the writers of the main story of World of Warcraft. Sorry, I won't forgive this. Oh, it was all in Warcraft 3. It wasn't. Stop. We know it wasn't. Don't lie to us. Come on. The retcon's fine, but it's a retcon. Just come on. Well, okay, maybe it's not a retcon because it adds to the story instead of changing something, but there is a definite retcon later that I'll get to. Anyway, so Varl is far more interesting in book form, it turns out. He talks about, his experience as the Arbiter, seeing so many lives, judging them, all this stuff, how cruel it was, how unfair, and it's just the most interesting he's ever been. Still not the most interesting guy in the world, but it's more interesting than anything we see in game of him. He also talks about fate and the predetermined nature of people's lives, and this is something that I think was mentioned in game, but it never really hit home for me. The fact that fate in the Warcraft universe is a thing, and it's what Sylvanas is trying to escape and everything. It's kind of a major revelation, and in fact all this stuff with Zovaal and the unfairness of not being able to see your family in the afterlife and fate predetermining your choices and all of that okay, so for clarity's sake, I'm 5 out of 7 chapters through 9.2. I haven't finished the 9.2 storyline myself yet, but I've got some general notions of where it goes from what I've seen people talking about, and it does make me wonder if they're going to actually address these concerns. Obviously they can't really handle the whole fate thing, but addressing the concerns of an unfair afterlife. I wonder if this whole fate deal is going to be something that continues to be explored in future expansions, or if they're just going to drop it because it was part of the Shadowlands storyline. Hopefully not. It was quite sad how Sylvanas' pragmatism bars her from going to meet Lirith in the Shadowlands. Like, she considers it, but she thinks that if she goes to him, the jailer will kind of have something to use against her at some later point, so she can't really do that. I thought it was interesting that when she finds Zul'jin in the Shadowlands and finds that he's been given a chance at redemption, she's super angry about it, because it kind of mirrors the player base and how so many people have been saying Sylvanas better not get a chance of redemption. So you see, while Anduin's normally representing the player base here, it's Sylvanas. I don't know why I found that funny. Again, as I've kind of already mentioned, this chapter 22, sorry, there isn't the chapter 33. Chapter 22 is a really good laying out of why the pattern is flawed, which isn't really shown in game to the best of my knowledge, and it, the jailer really does make a good argument, and again, you do kind of agree with him at points. Hashtag the jailer did nothing wrong. It's never really explained why the Valkyr and Sylvanas can leave the Moor. Obviously a Valkyr has to take Sylvanas' place in the Moor ultimately, but like, the fact that the Valkyr can just go and give Sylvanas a tour of the afterlives doesn't really make sense given the whole nothing can leave the Moor situation. I also think another plot hole is the fact that the jailer has these premonitions to give Sylvanas as these kind of, as Il'gyloth would say, 5 torches to lead her way, 5 torches to guide her. Yes, that's a direct paying off of one of the old god whispers, I guess. At no point in the Shadowlands story has it ever been mentioned that the jailer could foresee the future, and why, and how, and it just kind of came out of nowhere, and I again, it's the Shadowlands lore where all of this kind of starts to fall down, in my opinion. Like, oh, by the way, he can see the future. Okay. Sure, that might have been good to mention from the very start, at least, because otherwise it just feels like, oh, how are we going to get him to let Sylvanas know what's going on? Well, he can't leave the Moor, so I guess he can see the future? I don't know, it's dumb. Anyway, the actual premonitions themselves, I did enjoy. Like, a shadowy darkness will return, you must step out of the shadows to lead, a blade will pierce the heart of the world, you will hold the blood of a wound and sense its power, and finally you'll topple a king and shatter the sky itself. It's really cool to kind of like hear those things that we already know about as I don't want to say premonitions, that's not the right word. What's the word? Prophecies, that's the word. It's interesting to imagine whether it was there in the lore that the developers had intended at that point or not, that as these things were happening in Legion, Sylvanas was there going, oh, this is what the jailer told me about. It's just fun, isn't it? I like it. It's also worth noting that we can immediately tell that the jailer is lying about his true motive to Sylvanas from the start, because he says there will be time for compassion when the machine of death is remade, when we know that's not the case because he wants everyone to serve him against some greater threat. Also, again, he does literally tell her, yeah, you're probably going to have to do atrocities, but it's fine, it's for a greater good. He uses the word atrocities. I love it. But anyway, we're going back to some Cataclysm stuff now as she comes back to life, and I've just realised that my notes app auto-corrected Gen to Glenn. Her killing Gen's son is portrayed as a letting go of both the arrow and her morals, and it's the first act of jailer-driven evil, I guess, or at least it's portrayed that way, because now she's kind of reached this nihilism state of nothing matters, life and death don't matter, I can just kill indiscriminately because we're going to remake it all in the end anyway. But I don't think it's necessarily effective as the first instance of that, when she didn't even mean to kill his son. It was an accident because he jumped in front of the arrow. So if she had done it on purpose, maybe, but I don't think she did. It's also used as kind of like she's giving someone else the suffering of losing a loved one to an invading army for the first time. So she does have some moral quandaries about that she has to work out. But it was at this point in time that I first came across the idea that Sylvanas' thoughts, the reframing of her thoughts versus her pre-established dialogue, didn't always add up and wasn't always convincing. Again, I think Christie Golden did as good of a job as possible on that front, but I think it is still glaringly obvious at times. Theramore is mentioned in passing, and Sylvanas does seem to be a little bit shocked, and I think that's noteworthy considering what she does with Teldrassil later. She's still kind of adapting to the mindset that, nothing really matters. She takes away from it that life isn't fair, but I think when she's the perpetrator of it, she's saying that, I'm doing it for the greater good, so, I'm just not going to worry about how unfair all of this is for the people, because it's only short-term unfair, whereas this would have happened regardless, so that's probably why she's still a little bit shocked by it. Also, I'm still not entirely convinced that Teldrassil wasn't kind of a spur-of-the-moment decision, as much as the chapter about it tries to tell you a little bit otherwise. She definitely views Garrosh's trial and chance at atonement as being unfair, because she thinks he should have the death penalty. I liked the little bit extra we got around the short story where Sylvanas gets Nathanos a new body in the form of his younger cousin Stefan. I thought it was cute because, cute, that's a hell of a word to use given the situation. Still, in the short story, it's very much, she's like, I thought I would get a present for my champion so I could bone down, but in this it seems more like, she confides in him about the jailer, and he believes her, and he says he'll be with her for it and everything, and it kind of renews her love that she has for him. And she's like, I really need to do something about the fact that you're literally rotting away right now. I should probably try and make your life a little bit better, and also bone down. I really enjoyed chapter 24. This is the one set during Legion, and when Sylvanas becomes war chief. I really like it because of the war council scene. This is a scene that, to the best of my knowledge, we've never seen before in game or represented anywhere else, and it's when the Horde and the Alliance are sitting down to plan how to defend against the Legion's invasion of their world. And as you might expect, tensions are high, but Anduin, being the princely good boy that he is, sells everyone down, and he's brave, and he sits down first. And what I like most about it is that Sylvanas really admires and respects him during this chapter, and she kind of acquiesces and follows his lead. And what's interesting about this is that I've always felt that her presence in the cinematic of Legion, where she's Variant's ally and she's nodding to him and he's nodding back and they have like an understanding, was very different to her presence in the BFA trailer, where she's obviously, in the middle of a war that she's started and she's against the Alliance and she's attacking Anduin and all this stuff. But this book does a really good job of saying that, hey, if Sylvanas seems like she's all for peace right now, it's because she is kind of like, it really fits in with her character motivations and everything. Like, she's still down to murder thousands of people in a year or two, but for now, like, yeah, she's down. Sylvanas is such a multifaceted character, and this book does such a good job of conveying every side of her and why those sides appear when they do. That being said, I think an overall criticism I have of Sylvanas after having read this book is that she's perhaps too ambitious of a character, and like, not just Christie Golden. Like, Christie Golden, as I keep saying, did a fantastic job here, but just in general across the entirety of the story of Warcraft, I think Sylvanas was a bit too ambitious and it didn't entirely pay off. Anyway, two important things occur before Sylvanas makes her final decision to ally with the jailer. She's reminded of Lirith in the form of Anduin, and she watches a good ruler die pointlessly in the form of Vol'jin. His unceremonious spearing through the chest and death before he's really had a chance to make his mark on the world as war chief, smacks of unfairness. And I really like how Christie Golden took that and moulded it into this storyline for Sylvanas of how unfair that is and how nothing in life is fair and all this and all that. And when she says to the Horde, Vol'jin is dead, who will help me avenge him? She obviously, I say obviously, it is revealed that she doesn't just mean, let's attack the Legion with renewed vigour. It also means, let's remake the way the entire world works of life and death and fairness and cruelty and all that. Which, I guess, sure, half of me is like, that's really cool, and half of me is like, that definitely wasn't the original intention, again. Now, it's been a while since I did the Legion storyline in Storm Song, not Storm Song, the other one, the other stormy place with the stormy dragons and the Vikings. Stormheim. Goodness, there's a lot of places called Storm something in this game, aren't there? Anyway, the whole thing with the lantern, I'm not sure if that ever got fully explained. If it did, I need to go back and replay it because I clearly wasn't paying attention. But the fact that it was part of the whole jailer's plan and she needs it for stuff, oh my god, as I'm saying it out loud, I realise I've kind of forgotten again what it even was. It was like a soul catcher thing. I don't know. That part of Legion really didn't set my interests on fire. But I do find it interesting because this definitely seems like something that maybe was set up with the whole Shadowlands storyline in mind. I'm willing to believe that they started planning for Shadowlands as early as Legion. I still don't think that means that everything in Legion and BFA was leading to every decision that was made with the Shadowlands storyline, but I'm willing to believe. However, here's another thing Christie Golden can't quite explain. Why did Sylvanas and Ged let each other live after that fight? I don't know, because there was something left unspoken between them, I guess, question mark? That didn't feel right. It's actually the kind of thing that I probably wouldn't have even picked up on if it hadn't been mentioned, so I think it might have been a mistake to even mention it. I've never once given it thought as to the fact that they let each other live. It just seemed like the cinematic played with the fight. They beat each other up, they were injured, they both withdrew. That's all that needed to be. Okay, so at this point I was pretty sure I'd found a retcon, but I've just gone and looked it up and I am relieved to find that I am incorrect, although it still requires a lot of bending of what's already been told, as a lot of this novel has done. Basically, I was convinced that we had a short story called A Good War by Robert Brooks, which I thought was written by Christie Golden for a minute, which was from the point of view of Sylvanas, where she's deciding to go to war with the Alliance to basically hoard all the Azerite, become more powerful than them, and establish a peace that can't be broken, that she's enforcing. However, I just went and looked that up, and it's actually from Sourfang's point of view, and she's telling him that. So, it's never really explicitly said, but you can kind of infer that she's just lying to him, basically, to get him to go along. I just wanted to make note of that, because up until this very point in the recording, I believed I had found a retcon. It's not a retcon, at least not a obvious one, but I'm still not entirely trusting that that's not what we were meant to believe that Sylvanas believed at the time. But hey, we're getting a lot closer to Shadowlands at this point, so maybe it was always meant to be a lie for Sourfang, I don't know. It would have been nice if they had actually made that explicit in this novel. I'm going to be real with you, this video is 47 minutes long. I'm not going to go back and listen all the way through it just to find where I said I found a retcon. So when I said I found a retcon earlier, that's what it was. Sorry, I'm very unprofessional, but I'm also ill. Anyway, chapter 26 is when she goes and speaks to Lirith's grave again, even knowing that his spirit isn't going to be able to hear her after meeting Illyria and Verisa. And this proves that even at this point, she still has a heart. I guess she always had a heart, even when she was doing atrocities. But, you know, that's just part of the twisty-turny nature of Sylvanas. Can you tell that this second half of the book really has me kind of like, I love this book, I love what it tells us about Sylvanas, but I still don't love Sylvanas. I found it interesting that she called her Forsaken followers loyalists, or anima. One of those not convincing potential rewrites is during the burning of Teldrassil itself. In the cinematic, she says to Delarin, "Don't grieve, you'll soon be with your loved ones." Right? Remember that? Well, apparently, wrapped among like many paragraphs of explaining this, what she means is, you'll soon be with your loved ones as soon as I help the jailer remake existence. And that is probably the clunkiest feeling potential rewrite I have seen in this entire book. Because everything in that cinematic, especially Sylvanas' voice acting and direction and the expressions on her face, really does seem like this whole burning of Teldrassil thing is a spur-of-the-moment spiteful thing, and when she's saying these words to Delarin, it's not an actual promise like it's portrayed to be in this book. It's her being like, "Oh, don't worry, you'll soon be with your loved ones, like spiteful. Like, the entire burning of Teldrassil, I feel like in that cinematic, was portrayed to be spiteful, and this book is trying to tell me that it wasn't, that it was planned because the jailer needed more souls for the Maw, and that she's legitimately trying to comfort Delarin. I'm not buying it. And the thing that upsets me about that as well is it's one of the later parts of the story. It's one of the most likely scenes to have been written with the Shadowlands story in mind. Not to make this the second half of this video all about my grips with Sylvanas, but honestly, I think the biggest mistake Blizzard made with her writing was leaving us out of it. Was leaving us out of her plan and how she felt about the world and her nihilism and her believing that she was doing everything for a greater good. If we knew these things, it wouldn't be as frustrating her watching her do what she did. It would be more interesting, we would know why, we would still want to stop her and disagree with her, although you'd probably have people memeing that Sylvanas did nothing wrong. And I think that's kind of a way that Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers approaches its main villain without giving any spoilers. They inform us of things, they inform us of why they are doing things, and we still disagree and try to stop them. I much prefer that kind of villain, and I hope Blizzard will take that kind of feedback on board after all this. But I think one of the main reasons we didn't learn about why Sylvanas felt the way she did is because they didn't know that Sylvanas felt that way, because I'll just say it, her her writer around the Legion period of time turned out to be a massive jerk who was just doing things for shock value anyway because he wasn't very good at his job. I'm allowed to shit talk that human because that human is an actual literal pile of trash, as we have learned recently. Anyway, all that's left to talk about is the final interlude where Anduin easily psychoanalyzes her, and Sylvanas is like, no, you don't understand, I'm more complex than that. And he's like, no, you're not. I'm not your brother, Sylvanas. She's like, no, I never thought you were. And he's like, you literally just fucking told me you thought I was. And she's like, damn him, why did he have to listen to the things that I told him and disagree with me? I love that Anduin says, I once said that I thought you were lost, but I know better now. And your goal is worthy, but never the way the jailer intends it. I think that's really interesting too. Like, I still haven't played through the final stuff of 9.2. I'm probably going to go and do that today. But I'm curious for what this means for Anduin's character moving forwards, and how they finish Shadowlands. And I should probably have finished this before doing this video, but I wanted to record my thoughts while they were fresh in my mind. What can I say? Sue me. That of course means that I'm reading the epilogue out of order, sorry, because that does occur at the end of 9.2 when, spoilers, if you knew everything up until this point, Sylvanas' judgment has occurred, and she is, from what I can tell, made to go and take every soul that she's doomed to the Maw back to the Arbiter for actual judgment, which I think is a really effective way of handling her character, given how people didn't want her to have redemption. This is redemption after a fashion, but it's going to take her millennia, and it's also a really good way of solving the problem of the souls which are still trapped in the Maw. I liked this little POV point we got of her, where she's kind of like this mixing up of the two, of the Sylvanas we knew from the first half and the Sylvanas we knew from the second half. I loved the line, but she was fiercely glad of every painful moment. It shows how far she's come. She's excited to maybe reunite with Lirith and her parents when she's done with this task that's going to take her thousands of years, because she actually believes in a reformed Shadowlands now the Covenants are working together, which I guess answers my earlier question. Like, guys, maybe just allow visits between different Covenants, different afterlives. Doesn't sound very difficult. That just like allow family days out to Maldraxxus, free popcorn. I guess I'm a sucker because for romantic stuff, because I found it touching that Sylvanas was also like looking for Nathanos in the Maw. She'd found him before and she can find him again. Oh, that's sweet, isn't it? That's just kind of cute. I'm not entirely sure why the clank of plate armor gave her hope at the very end. It was left ambiguous. Nathanos doesn't wear plate armor, so that can't have been him, so I don't know what that was meant to be. I've clearly missed something there, but that's it. That's the end of the book. That's all she wrote, literally. That's all Christie Golden wrote for us, and it was so good. It was so good, I could not put this book down. I loved every moment of it, even the things that I went into a lot of detail that I had nitpicks about. That's a personal flaw of mine, I think, or maybe not a personal flaw, but the way I criticize things. I would give this book like a 90% or more as a rating, but like the 5% or more that I have as nitpicks, I go into like lots of detail about, because I need to talk about why they're there, as opposed to the rest of the book that I really enjoyed. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. If anyone out there listened to 53 minutes or more of me rambling about this book, thank you. I know this wasn't as well put together as it could have been, but this book made me feel things and I had to get them out there. Feel free to let me know what you thought about Sylvanas down below. If you think that I'm completely wrong and this book is a steaming pile of poo-poo, well, you can probably actually just not put that in the comments. That's not really very nice, is it? Either way, I'm going to go back to reading The Wheel of Time now. Thank you very much for listening. I will see you in the next video. Farewell.